Mrs. Fitzgerald, completely opposite to Mrs. Pearson, I would say, who is older, heavier and strong, who has a sinister personality. Then she is also a fortune teller. He was an English novelist, a playwright, screenwriter, broadcaster and a social commentator. Fitzgerald will switch with Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Pearson will switch into Mrs. Fitzgerald. As you, that is what she means by that. Hello and a very warm welcome to your prep school English classes. I am your English teacher, Kshama. In this session today, we are going to learn about yet another chapter from your supplementary textbook, Snapshots, named as the Mother's Day. Well, what's special about Mother's Day? We celebrate Mother's Day every year. But something that is special or something that we have been called for out of this lesson in a satirical way is that Mother's Day isn't to be celebrated only on that just particular one day, isn't it? It is to be celebrated throughout our lives, throughout the year. And I guess that is what the author over here, J.B. Priestley, is trying to tell us. Without wasting any time, let's understand what is this lesson about. It's a play. And we have a couple of interesting characters over here, which you might have come across in a couple of books, in a couple of TV shows perhaps, okay? So let's waste no time and start by understanding what is there in this session today. So we have to talk about the author, J.B. Priestley, then the background of the story, what is happening, who are the characters, how are they by their nature, how do they look, how do they interact with each other, then the summary, and we'll quickly recap whatever that we saw in this particular lesson. So to start with, J.B. Priestley. Let's understand who J.B. Priestley is. He was an English novelist, a playwright, screenwriter, broadcaster and a social commentator. Now, so much in one person, right? His Yorkshire background is reflected in much of his work, fiction, notably in The Good Companions. Okay, and then the University of Bradford awarded Priestley the title of Honorary Doctor of Letters in 1970. Moving forward, he was awarded the Freedom of the City of Bradford in 1973. Also, his connections with the city were also marked by the naming of the J.B. Priestley Library. There's a library after him, imagine, named after him at the University of Bradford, which he officially opened, he himself opened in 1975. Then, larger-than-life statue of him commissioned by the Bradford City Council after his death and which now stands in front of the National Media Museum. So there's also a larger-than-life statue of him. There's a library that's named after him. So you see that how much of a significant personality he was and what sort of significant contribution he must have made to the world of literature. So let's understand what he has written for us in Mother's Day. As the story begins, as the play begins, we see two characters interacting with each other. The first one is Miss Pearson. Mrs. Pearson, who is at right, sitting at right, and Mrs. Fitzgerald at the left. So they are sitting opposite to each other, then on a small table. So they are sharing a small cup of tea and they're sitting on the small table. There's one right side we have Mrs. Pearson, onto the left side we have Mrs. Fitzgerald. Now, let's understand what sort of a person is Mrs. Pearson. She's a pleasant but almost, looking worried all the time. She's a pleasant looking woman, but there's a sense of worry or sense of trouble in her all the time, okay? So, a woman who looks a little discomforted in her 40s, that's her age. Then there is Mrs. Fitzgerald, completely opposite to Mrs. Pearson, I would say, who is older, heavier and strong, who has a sinister personality. Then she is also a fortune teller, somebody who is going to tell you about what is going to happen, who is going to predict future for you, okay? Then East, now our Mrs. Pearson over here, curiously she asks, where did you learn all of this? Where did you learn all this, fortune-telling trick of yours? To which our Mrs. Fitzgerald, she actually reveals where she has learned all of these. She was living in East for about 12 years, where her husband, my old lieutenant quartermaster, he then went on to become a lieutenant quartermaster, and that is where she lived for 12 years. Of course, she picked up the art of fortune-telling there. Then, be the mistress of your own house. Now we come to the actual point of the lesson. Our Mrs. Pearson over here, who is a pleasant looking, calm lady who looks a little stressed and worried. And that is because she's unable to take charge of her own house. None of the family members, such as her 2 kids, as well as her husband, they don't treat her very cordially, very warmly, and take everything that she does for granted. Hence, Mrs. Fitzgerald gives her an advice and says, be the master of your own house and the boss of your own family, right? But to which our Mrs. Pearson replies and says, it's easier, right? To say it is all easier, but to do it, actually, it's hard. I don't think I can hurt them. I don't think I can do it, right? I'm so fond of them, even if they are so thoughtless and selfish. She's well aware of the fact that these family members are cold towards her. Yet, she has a very kind heart and does not want to hurt them, right? That's how every mother is, isn't it? Then, husband's sons are Mrs. Fitzgerald, who has a sensitive personality, who's old, heavier, and all of those. She's a very strong character over here and says, husband's sons, daughters should be taking notice. They should, pay attention to what you are doing, what you are contributing for the sake of the family, how much you're sacrificing, right? Of wives and mothers, not giving them orders and treating them like dirt. They should not disrespect you. That's the gist of it. Then, I do keep on dropping hints of, you shouldn't be treating me like this, says Mrs. Pearson. But is that enough? No. Hate and unpleasantness, I don't like that. And that is the reason I am avoiding this, the confrontation is what she means. Don't know how to begin. And she starts worrying about, now all of 2 of my kids, my husband, they're about to come home. Nothing is ready. Tea is not ready. And she starts worrying about all of that. She doesn't know how to begin. She doesn't know how to be the boss of her house. But then she also realized nothing is ready yet. Then, let me do it as you, says Mrs. Fitzgerald. Now, what does she mean by I can do it? If you don't know how to begin, how to take charge of your own house, I can do that for you. Now, how can Mrs. Fitzgerald be the solution to Mrs. Pearson's problem? She says, yeah, as you. How is that possible? Let's understand. Then they decide to switch their, bodies. The souls or the inner person will be the same, but then they switch themselves. Now, Fitzgerald will switch with Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Pearson will switch into Mrs. Fitzgerald. As you, that is what she means by that. Now, her spirit, her personality for that matter, Fitzgerald's personality is coming into Mrs. Pearson, and that is how she's going to teach them all a lesson. Now, in order to do that, they both hold hands and say this spell, which is Arshata Dum, Arshata Lam, Arshata Lam Dum Bun. I know that sounds funny, but what is going to come next is not funny at all, okay? So, right when the spell is spoken, the spell is told, they completely exchange personalities. The body is the same. What if we can't change back, right? Mrs. Pearson is now scared. What if we can't change back? And I continue to be in the body of Mrs. Fitzgerald. Then Fitzgerald says, it's not that, discomforting or it's not that a problem at all because my life is much more fun. As, for me, it might be a problem being stuck as Mrs. Pearson forever in your body. However, my life is much more fun than you can ever imagine. Then Mrs. Fitzgerald, who's now in the body of Mrs. Pearson, asks her to go to her house for some time and then starts with playing her cards and smoking. Well, let me tell you, Mrs. Pearson has never been this lady who, plays cards and, sits idly and drinks, smokes and all of those things. However, who is in her body now? It's Mrs. Fitzgerald, and that's what is new. All right, let's see what else is happening. Then we see Doris Pearson, the eldest daughter of Mrs. Pearson, entering in. Okay, so she's a pleasant girl, only if enough, if not spoiled. She's a completely spoiled brat. Okay, and then when she comes in, she says, have you ironed my yellow silk? I want it. I have to wear it today night, and it should be ready. Right when she enters, all she wants from her mother is not, how are you doing? How was your day? Not all of that. Just straight away ordering her to do something, right? Iron my yellow silk for tonight. That's what I want. And she is completely dumbstruck by looking at her mother who is smoking. That doesn't happen every single day, isn't it? Then, do you mean the tea isn't ready? Now, then the mother says, okay, you can iron it if you want. What do you mean? Will it iron itself? Iron by itself or something? No, it will not. You have to get up, go iron it. Do it if you want, girl, says Mrs. Pearson. She is not in the mood to work for today. Doris Pearson asks if the tea is ready. The mother says, no, yours is not ready. I don't know about your tea. Then the daughter is shocked again. She says, what do you mean? You mean the tea isn't ready? Yours isn't. Yours isn't. I don't know about yours. I've had mine. Okay. Now, mom, what's the matter with you? No, what is wrong with you? You weren't like this. This is not the usual behavior of Mrs. Pearson, and that is what is shocking to Doris Pearson, who is the daughter of Mrs. Pearson. Then, is it a bit much? Been working hard all day and you can't even bother to get me tea? Do you think the yellow silk is going to iron itself? Is it not a bit too much that I've worked all day hard and you can't even make a small cup of tea for me? Right. The mother has heard it all and then says, I have done twice the work, twice the hours of work as you do, and get no wages and no thanks for it. This is the reality check, isn't it? Mothers or homemakers, for that matter, stay at home. They work twice as hard and twice as long as all of us out there, whoever comes out to do the work. It could be probably hardly, 6 to 8 hours of work. However, whoever stays at home does much more than that. It's like 24/7. There's no resting at all. And on top of that, there's no wages, no thanks also. All of that is taken for granted just because none of that is paid for, right? Then, I'm going to go out with Charlie. Okay, that is where I'm going. Are you going to question that as well now? Now that your complete behavior has been changed, asks Doris Pearson. Then, any objections for that now? Now, the mother has completely lost the cool and she has decided to, spit all the truth, be the savage version of herself, which is, of course, as we all know, that it's Mrs. Fitzgerald who's speaking and not Mrs. Pearson. And she says, that buck-teeth, half-witted would have found better or given myself up as a bad job. I mean, all that you could find was that guy with buck teeth and half-wit. I would have tried hard. Otherwise, I would have given up on myself as a bad job and not settled for this guy over here. Just speaking the facts right out, okay? So Doris is completely hurt and she's nearly in tears. Oh, shut up. What are you even saying? You've never been this cold, brutal. Why are you doing this? Okay? And then comes Cyril Pearson, the son, of course, and he's also the replica of Doris Pearson and nothing else. He's also very cold to her. And then comes, Mom, is the tea ready? To which she says, I did not bother to keep your tea ready. And have you put my things out? Have you kept my things ready at least? I had asked you to do it and you said, what if some of them require repair? I'll do it for you and all of that you had told. Have you kept that ready at least? I doubt it. I don't think I've done that either. Now, the mother is giving shock treatments to each person of the family, one at a time. Now, what would happen if we all talked like that? Mother, you're talking like this. What would happen if we all also talk like that? You do. You do talk like that all the time, tells Mrs. Pearson. Then, Doris enters in between. She's hurt, as you all remember. Wouldn't wear that face, even if for Charlie Spence, right? Now, the mother is not stopping at all, or Mrs. Fitzgerald is not stopping at all. And she says, I mean, I know it's Charlie Spence that you're going out on a date tonight with, but even for him, I wouldn't go out with that face of yours, which is like completely, dipped in tears. Now, she says, that's because of you, Mom. That's because you made me cry. My face looks like this. You are responsible. Then Mrs. Pearson, who is none other than Mrs. Fitzgerald inside her, goes to the kitchen looking for stout and she's in the mood to drink something, okay? Now, both of these are also confused. What's wrong with Mom, okay? Then, has she been like that with you too? They both start whispering with each other now. Has she been the same with you as well? Now, they want to know if it's not just them and both of them together are in trouble. Glad it's both. I thought I did something wrong. Both of them talked about it. And then I asked her if she's feeling off color, tells Cyril over here. Cyril would have asked her, are you feeling okay? Is there something wrong, right? She said she wasn't. She's not feeling any off color. She's not feeling any low or anything. She's never felt better, in fact, right? Not what she said, but the way she said and the look. That's what bothered Doris. Now, Cyril expressed this, whilst our Doris over here expressed, it's not what she's saying, but the way she's saying, the look in her face, all of that is making me feel terrible, right? Has she hit her head or something, right? Do you think she's gone balmy? Or No, fathead, it's not balmy or something. Do you think she's been getting concussions? Is there anything? They're all talking about the gist of this being that, is there anything physically wrong with her? Has she hit her head? Is she feeling low? Is she feeling bad with her health? Or what is happening? They're trying to rationalize her behavior, okay? This new behavior of hers. For once, be of your age. Now comes Mrs. Pearson and says, can you both stop whispering and just act according to your age for once? You all, seem to be or act as though you're so much grown up, you're so matured all the time. You keep lecturing me all the time. Why do you not act accordingly sometimes at least? Okay, what do you think now? The kids ask, can we not laugh also now? We are talking about something and we are laughing. Can we not do that as well? You have objections to that as well? To which she says, you never understand our jokes, mum. Okay, don't worry about it. Don't bother about it, mum. You never understand our jokes. Again, humiliating her, making her also feel bad. To us, this is only one perspective of Mrs. Fitzgerald, how she is treating them for one day. Imagine being treated like this. You don't understand our jokes, keep the yellow silk ready, get it ironed, where's my tea, ordering and expecting from her all the time. And despite that, treating her bad all the time. Think about it, 365 days, 24/7. How would the mother feel, right? Now, she starts yawning, Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is in the body of Mrs. Pearson. She says, I've been yawning at your jokes ever since even before you were born, Doris. Again, throwing hurtful comments at Doris like an arrow or a bullet. Then we see that come in and ask for something. All that you do is just come in, ask for something, get things done and just go away without any regard, without any concern, right? Go out again. Then come back when there is nowhere else to go. That's what you do. You guys don't have a sense of belongingness, sense of gratefulness. That's all the mother asks for. A little bit of respect, a little bit of, gratefulness, a little bit of attachment and concern. Is that too much to ask for all that she does, relentlessly all the time for her kids? All that you do is this. Then I'll find something to eat for myself. Cyril is unbothered by all of this and he says, I've worked hard all day long and I need to feed myself with something. I'm going to go find something by myself. Mrs. Pearson is least bothered. Go find something for yourself and eat. Who's stopping you? Working 8 hours a day, I'm tired. The mother says, yeah, me too. I've also worked hard. But then they say, Mom, that's different. Right? We go out, work, we do all of that. No kind of work can get more importance and no kind of work is inferior compared to the other one. Every kind of work that you do is equally important. Somebody who stays at home and works, does not get paid. Just because they don't get paid doesn't mean what they do is not valuable, isn't it? That debate also happens here. That's not different. 40 hours a week. And probably she blasts another bomb over here and she says, I think I might take a weekend, 2 days off or something. Where are you going to go? Ask the children, asks Doris. I mean, that's my business. I'm a grown-up. I will go, says Mrs. Pearson. I'm much older than you. I can do that by myself. And she also says, I'll hit you if you don't stop asking me all these nonsense questions. I'm much more older. I can take care of myself. All right? Stop asking silly questions. And then Doris feels awful again. George Pearson, Mrs. Pearson's husband, George Pearson, enters now. And what's all this crying about? He sees Doris crying and he wants an explanation for that right away. All that he's noticing is Doris crying. So she says, what could possibly be wrong for, in order to make Doris crying? Then I don't like it because he sees Mrs. Pearson having stout. And he says, what is this new thing? I'm surprised. And I don't like surprises and I don't like you having stout. Now, she is doing something, whatever that she likes on a broad daylight, and she needs permission from all of them in order to do something that she wants to do, right? Now, wouldn't want any tea. He says, I also wanted to tell you that I have a special snooker match at night, so I don't want any tea. To which Mrs. Pearson says, yeah, there isn't any way. There's no tea at all. And then he actually becomes angry at the fact that she has not prepared any tea. Like, how stupid or bizarre is this? He doesn't want this tea in the first place and he's mad at the tea that is not there, right? Annoyed that there is no tea that he doesn't want, okay? Try that in your, evening night match or in your bar that you go to every night. They don't laugh at me. She reveals that they laugh at you all the time in the bar. Try doing that in the bar that you go to every single day. He says, no, they don't laugh at me. That's not true. He tries to defend himself. Of course they do. They call you Pompey Pearson. Okay? You're slow and pompous, and that's why they call you Pompey Pearson. Now, the world out there can be cruel to you, cannot be welcoming sometimes. But despite knowing all of your loopholes, all of your negativities and everything, the family or back home is the only place where you're comforted throughout all your difficulties, throughout all your negativities and all of that, right? She knew that they called him this all throughout, but then she had never told him. Fitzgerald also knew it. However, she reveals, she blasts that as well. Okay? Instead of going out with your wife, instead of spending time with your wife, instead of being with her, you go out every night only to be humiliated, insulted and be, and laughed at by others, by strangers out there, who doesn't make you look like a fool. You choose the bar. That's what you do. You've hurt these feelings. Now, Cyril is very much concerned about his father's feelings out of the blue. And he says, you've hurt his feelings. Look what you have done. You've hurt my feelings too. And Doris is also crying because of you. Sometimes it does people good. Sometimes it does people good to know the reality, to know the truth. Sometimes there should be this reality check every once in a while. That's good. I doubt it is whether your opinion is worth of having. And then Cyril also gets his counter. I don't know if your opinions are worth having also, Cyril. So don't just, express it with me. Too much time and good money at greyhound races and dirt tracks and ice shows. You also spend in a lot of money in unnecessary places like these. Okay? So do you take anybody else's opinion in that one? No. You do whatever that gives you joy, isn't it? Then there's a knocking that is heard. And at the door, Cyril says, it is my wish. I go, I spend my money. What's with you? Then he hears the knock at the door and then he goes over there to see, only to find that it is Mrs. Fitzgerald. But whose personality is it? It's Mrs. Pearson. Pearson's personality inside Mrs. Fitzgerald. She's really worried. She's really concerned as to what is happening in the house and she has come over there. Silly old bag from the next door. That's Mrs. Fitzgerald. See how disrespectful he is towards her. And just putting him in their places, that's all, which is long due. And our Mrs. Pearson over here, she tells Mrs. Fitzgerald who has come, okay, I'm just putting them all in their places, which was long due, that had to be done. I'm just doing that. That's all. Then Cyril storms out to the kitchen when he is asked to treat Mrs. Fitzgerald, who was at the door, to treat her with respect. He storms out to the kitchen and George enters. He is unpleasantly surprised to have a neighbor who is not, part of the family. She is also sitting over there whilst there's some discussion happening over here. Why is this neighbor here? Okay, and he's unpleasantly surprised about it. And then in the middle of the conversation, while Fitzgerald and Pearson and our George over here comes and sits, they are also a little discomforted with each other's presence and everything. Then Mrs. Pearson's personality, who is inside Mrs. Fitzgerald's body, she unknowingly addresses, George Pearson as not as Mr. Pearson, but as George. Now, only the wife is supposed to call him like that, isn't it? That surprises George Pearson and he's like, she's calling me by name as well. Now, that's also happening. You're allowing that also to happen. So he doesn't know the switching, isn't it? Now, that's how the confusion happens. Pompey Pearson, no tea, Doris is crying. Now, what is happening? This woman from the neighborhood is calling me George. And I get to know that people in the bar call me Pompey Pearson, no tea, Doris is crying. What is wrong? What is happening today? Then why ought you to have known? Fitzgerald, Mrs. Pearson. Now he asks another question. I should have known, tells Mrs. Pearson, I should have known all of this would happen. Now, why are you including yourself in all of this conversation? George Pearson is unable to figure out all of these. But you and I, we figure out, right? It's because Mrs. Pearson is in Mrs. Fitzgerald's body. She's, the motherly feeling and the responsible women's feeling, all of that is coming out of her and she's reciprocating, responding to all of these things. Then, no excuse, George Pearson, behave, tells Mrs. Fitzgerald, or in Mrs. Pearson's body, we have Mrs. Fitzgerald, the spinster personality. Remember, she says, there's no excuse for such behavior that you're showing now. Behave yourself, okay? Go on then, don't disappoint him. Getting the neighbors into the scene. So you are getting the neighbors also to see the fun, whatever that is happening over here, isn't it? Then tell her to stop. Then there'd be some sense in it. Now he asks whoever the Fitzgerald or Pearson that has come, tell her to stop. Then that makes a little sense. Okay. So answers Mrs. Fitzgerald properly. Doris, or go upstairs again. Now Doris comes and Mrs. Fitzgerald also, or within brackets, Mrs. Pearson tries to talk with her. Were you not, getting ready to go out with Charlie Spence? What happened? And then Doris also replies very rudely. To which Mrs. Fitzgerald or Mrs. Pearson over here tells that, either talk to her properly or just go upstairs. Okay. I give up, don't look at me. When she looks at her father, father's like, don't look at me. I have given up because I have not been able to figure out what is happening over here. Mrs. Fitzgerald, I'll manage my family. Ticking her off now. Are you, Annie? Now, Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is in the body of Mrs. Pearson, when she is taking everything into control, on the other hand, Mrs. Pearson is losing her calm and she says, I'll take care of my family. What is happening? Then she says, no. I'll take care of my family, says Fitzgerald. And now George says, what, you are yelling at her also now? Then that's enough. They decide that both the women have to have a little private talk. When they are supposed to have this private talk, she corrects herself hastily with Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Pearson, can we really talk for a moment now? Mrs. Pearson is asking her body, herself now. Need to switch as soon as possible. This has gone too far. Okay, and they do the same process where they hold hands and they tell the spell and they switch both their personalities and come to their proper bodies. Then don't go soft on them. Now that everything has come to under your control, do not go soft on them. You'll just have to start from the scratch, taking orders from them, taking dirt from them all over again. Don't do that to yourself. Explaining and apologizing back to where you were. Now is the testing. Let's see what you're going to do now, tells Fitzgerald. And when she's about to leave, she looks at Mrs. Pearson and says, I request you, again, remember, don't do the same thing again. Don't go back to explaining everything, apologizing everything, getting them tea, taking their orders. Don't do that. All right. Then you see, she says, okay, I need to talk to Doris, Cyril, and George. There are a couple of things that I want you to do. Is there any problem? Can we do that? Now you see that Mrs. Pearson is finally able to take control, take charge of her household. And she's not requesting, she's not apologizing. She's just, asking them to do something for her. First one, stay at home, hand with supper and a game of rummy. That's what I want them to do. Then Mrs. Fitzgerald says, final warning, remember. And she asks, Mrs. Pearson asks, is there any objection? Then George Pearson says, no, definitely not. Whatever you say, we'll do that. Messing with mother is a very wrong idea. So now this is a very sarcastic way to call out the fact that most mothers or most women in their household are not respected enough, are not valued enough. And when they start taking charge, we all ought to listen to them. And it's not just that we have to push them to a certain extent where they have no choice but to take charge of things and stand up for themselves. It is our duty to respect them, give them their space, give them their breaks. They also have a life of their own. They're also an individual themselves and not just, a random part or a piece of the household, right? So on that note, I hope you enjoyed the lesson where we met two characters in the beginning, which is Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Fitzgerald is a very heavy old fortune teller. And we have Mrs. Pearson, who's a pleasant looking, subtly worried all the time, who's in her 40s. Then we realize that Mrs. Pearson hasn't been able to take charge of her house. And Mrs. Fitzgerald over here decides to help. And they switch their personalities, or the bodies are the same, they switch personalities. And that's how Mrs. Fitzgerald takes control of Doris Pearson, Cyril Pearson, and George Pearson and makes them all value our Mrs. Pearson over here. When Mrs. Pearson switches back to her personality, she also does not let go of this, change that has happened, a good progressive change that has happened where she is also treated and respected like a human being and decides to continue the same and takes, her share of respect and value. So that's about Mother's Day. I hope you have enjoyed the lesson. I hope you have your share of takeaways as well. On that note, I'll see you all in the next class. Thank you.